to go back to thinking about ethics. We won't be into math, so for those of you who need a break from the mathematical, we'll have that break today. And one of the themes that was, a couple of themes that were mentioned over the last, actually 2 weeks, were these questions about both well-being and responsibility. And so today what I'll do is kind of go backwards. We'll start by talking about well-being, and then we'll go back and talk a little bit about responsibility. But another important ethical concept that has come up in the last little while that we'll go back to, or we'll get to in a few weeks, is equality. But today we're not even really going to have enough time to go through well-being and responsibility fully, but I wanted to start with that. And we've heard a couple of times now that ethical judgments of value underline almost every decision that's connected with climate change. I really enjoyed this image that I discovered, because we want to look and see what are those values that underlie all of these decisions, and that's what we do today. But there's also a double entendre here, because this is someone putting their head in the sand. And sometimes thinking about these ethical issues, these ethical questions, can feel a lot like, if not exactly putting your head in the sand, sort of going into a realm that's not practical. And what I'm hoping that we could do today is see the ways that our discussions about values, our discussions about well-being, our discussions about responsibility are actually quite practical and not this sort of typical abstract philosophical position. Okay, we talked about cookies. This is practical. How many cookies do you have if you give up your immediate desire for cookies? Let's say next month you want a whole stack of cookies to make up for what you're missing right now. And I'm going to just complicate this as a way of illustrating what ethical issues we might be facing. And when we're thinking just about chocolate chip cookies, we might be able to make this kind of choice. But what if we learn that there are children who are enslaved to capture or collect the cacao that goes into the chocolate chips? That's going to change our valuation of these cookies. What if we learn there's palm oil in the cookies that's destroying the orangutans, and as we saw last week, also creating tremendous greenhouse gas emissions? Or what if we're just allergic to the nuts that are in the cookies, right? All of these features of this picture aren't thought about, aren't talked about, and change, I want to argue, the values that are in play. And these raise a variety of really important, I think, questions. One of the questions is that my choices aren't being fully captured. The values of my choices aren't being fully captured when we're talking simply about how much are you willing to give up now for the future, or how much do you need to get in the future to give up something now. There's additional kinds of values at play, and that has to be part of our overall deliberative choice when we're thinking about the ethical issues. So that's one of the things, that there's a series of other values that often get truncated in our conversations, and we need to figure out a way to bring these other values into our quote-unquote equation. That's one of the things. The other thing that I think is really important, and I want to flag this now, we'll talk about this again at the end of today's lecture, and that's, well, how much responsibility do I have for child slavery if I eat one cookie, or even 10 cookies? Assuming, and this is not, I'm not making this up, there is a lot of evidence and documentaries that have been made, data that's collected that children are enslaved for certain kinds of chocolate production. Various companies are being asked to disclose whether or not they do have protected child labor practices. So there is a movement, but is it my responsibility? What do I actually cause child slavery by eating a chocolate chip cookie? That seems kind of extreme, right? The other question we might ask is, if I use palm oil, which is ubiquitous, it's in everything, am I actually the one who's responsible for deforestation and the sort of increasingly precarious position that orangutans are in Indonesia? Or is it just that my eating these cookies, which may be the product of a problematic set of corporate practices, is really my contribution to those bad things is negligible. So I think that this is something we want to think about. It has interesting and important implications for our thinking about greenhouse gas emissions. But we'll get to that in a moment. I want to instead focus, as I said, on the first part of the lecture on different theories of well-being to help us to try to imagine how we might put more values into the equation when we're thinking about what we ought to be doing. So there are three broad theories of well-being. This slide, I just want to give you a slide. This slide was initially had a million different things and lines going back and forth because actually under each of these three broad theories, there's a variety of different kinds of theories. I realize you don't need to know that debate. This debate has been going on in philosophical ethics for hundreds of years, but you don't need to really worry about that. What I want you to worry about is these three different broad ways of thinking about what constitutes well-being. Subjective state views say that our well-being is really equivalent to or just based on our happiness or pleasure, that it has to do with how we feel, what our experiences are. A desire satisfaction view is a view that has to do not just with how I feel, but whether how I feel is linked up with some sort of satisfaction in the world, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And the objectivist view says that well-being is something that you can actually define independent of how anybody might feel about it. That this is the kind of thing that we can make a list, and I'll show you a list that's been made that says this is what would constitute well-being. Now, each of these three views of well-being, as we'll see, have problems associated with them, but they're very distinctive views, and that has implications for whether or not we can ultimately derive informative utility functions to think through some of the questions that we've been talking about earlier in the week. So the first notion, and here we have some of the graphs that you saw. These are graphs that are derived from this view about well-being that's a subjective state view. In this case, Deaton was tracking through surveys different ways in different countries that people express satisfaction in relationship with GDP. Right? So there's a survey that's given, how happy are you about this? How satisfied are you about this? And in a similar case, we see this with individuals in the Deaton and Kahneman exploration of what we were talking about this week in terms of diminishing marginal utility. As your income rises, your happiness sort of stabilizes, okay? So these are both subjective theories of well-being. They come from Bentham, who you saw pictures of, that old guy who got dragged into the seminar rooms even after he was dead. I think he's actually, that body is coming to the United States, or might actually already be here. And he's in a museum in New York, very perverse. But he actually had this idea that there was a possibility that we would develop what he thought of as a hodometer. A thermometer equivalent that measures hedons, or the sort of what is equivalent to our hedonistic pleasures. So there's these things called spires. Has anybody heard of them? They're these little devices. They're not quite Fitbits, but they actually measure sort of whether you're calm or whether you're excited. And so when I used to teach Bentham, this idea that you would have a hodometer that you could put on your head to measure your subjective well-being. I think that you have 12 today. I have 10. Some of you won't have. But actually, it's not that far-fetched at this point to do a series of sort of calculations of what we might see. There's studies that have been done that measure smiling to see if you smile in a particular way, you could actually try to assume how happy the person might be. So it's not completely far-fetched, but these are all subjective state notions of well-being. That your well-being is something that you experience, that you feel, your temperature might rise, your blood pressure might rise or lower, your smile might broaden, your breath and your respiration rate might go up or down. All of these things are thought to be a subjective state way of thinking about well-being. And they're measurable either by your reporting or by, maybe miraculously, something that's going on in your body. Now, as we also mentioned, the idea that you can report honestly is problematic. People often lie in these surveys, as we heard. But the other thing that's really important is we sometimes actually don't know what makes us happy. Right? But one of the more interesting problems about subjective theories of well-being come out in the Matrix. Now, has anybody known about this? Have you known the Matrix? How many people have seen the Matrix? Okay, so the idea of the Matrix is that you can actually have terrifically happy experiences. They're just not real in some machine. This is an idea that goes back to a philosopher, Robert Nozick, a libertarian philosopher from Harvard, who thought of this notion of the experience machine. And the experience machine is this machine that can give you whatever experiences of happiness you might want. So it can enhance your well-being simply by programming you to think you're having happy experiences. And you might even say that if happy experiences aren't the thing that make you feel like you have achieved subjective well-being, you might be able to program into the computer that's giving you these brain stimulations challenges that you overcome. So now you actually are overcoming challenges, and that makes you feel like you have satisfied something. But the problem is it's not real at all, right? It has no traction. It doesn't actually connect to the real world. And so that has led many theorists to worry about the subjective state theories of well-being in favor of something that's more like a desire satisfaction theory of well-being. And the desire satisfaction theory of well-being actually makes it the case that in order to see whether or not your life is a good life, you have well-being, is that your desire to solve, let's say, a problem that's going to enhance your well-being, your happiness, your pleasure, you actually do solve the problem. It's not that you have the illusion that you solved the problem, you've actually solved the problem. Your desire to solve the problem is actually satisfied because, in fact, you solved the problem in the real world. And so the subjective state views are views that don't require that the world and you be connected. That's the idea of the matrix. Whereas desire satisfaction views do have you connected to the world. And there's a list of things that I just put here. Some of Mark's work, that's what we have on this side, is trying in some ways to get closer to this notion of desire satisfaction. But the idea here is that there's a variety of different things that we value, and we value them in relationship to others, not just ourselves and our own mental states, but our happiness and our well-being is fundamentally tied to the world and other people in the world. So here's a list of a variety of different ways of thinking about well-being. Some of these you might imagine we could come up with surveys or other ways of measuring it so that we can sort of quantify over these, maybe pleasure, certainly freedom, right? We can measure freedom. If you can't go places, if you're not, if you're restricted in certain ways from doing various things. Respect, that's a little bit harder. You can't actually figure out whether you get respect from other people. How does that fit into some sort of quantifiable measurement? Being a good person? Well, being a good person you could report, but usually being a good person involves other people recognizing that you're a good person. Friendship, I think, is a really useful and interesting concept to think about. And it's actually a little bit of self-revelation. So I used to be philosophically a utilitarian. And a utilitarian philosophically is a little different than the utilitarians we talked about this week. But a utilitarian philosophically is someone who thinks that the right thing to do is the thing that's going to maximize good consequences, all things considered. And I thought, that sounds good. I like that view. I want to act in the world in ways that are good, and I want my actions to enhance other people's good. So that sounds like a good theory. And then I tried to think about how friendship could be analyzed in a philosophical utilitarian framework. It's really hard, because here's one of the things that you would do if you were a utilitarian. One friend needs your help, and you have to decide whether to go help that friend, where 3 or 4 other friends don't really need your help, but really would enjoy your company. In this case, if you're a utilitarian, what you want to do is maximize the best consequences, and it turns out that I should not help my friend, my single friend, and go hang out with my 4 friends who will get a lot of pleasure out of my company. Well, that struck me as a little bit problematic, because then I'm not really a friend. I'm just using these people in my life as ways of promoting utility. And so I thought that was a really big concern. You might say, and I thought about this, that no, you can make sense of friendship because in this case, really helping your friend who needs your help, that really is the thing that's going to lead to the best consequences, and just hanging out with the 4 isn't. But you can imagine cases in which you could drop your friend who really needs you for some other group of friends, or other group of strangers who might really need you. And so then the very idea of friendship becomes problematic, because part of what it means to be a friend is to recognize and value that person, not because of how much you could help them, not only that, but because there's a trust and a reliance that they have with you and on you. And so that's part of what I think this new idea what new for us, idea of well-being helps us to recognize. That it's not simply about calculation, but we might have desires that need to be satisfied that may not be ultimately utility producing. Okay, there is a problem, though, here with these theories of well-being as well, and that is that we are sometimes, in this sort of case, have certain kinds of desires that actually are, I'm just going to call them quirky desires, that actually could be ultimately harmful. And the other thing about desire satisfaction views is that, so what I'm getting at here is we might actually desire things that cause harms, and satisfying those desires might lead to harms. That's not good. The other idea is that the other problem with the desire satisfaction view is that you might have sort of desires for things that aren't good for you. I mean, I know actually, I often have desires to eat way more sweets and cookies and cake than it's good for me. I have those desires. So we might think that this desire satisfaction view has a few problems. And some of those problems have led people to think about what we call the objective list theory. Now here's a list. This is Martha Nussbaum's list. It's a really long list. Now what it gets at is this notion that we have well-being if we live in a society in which these things are possible. You don't have to do them, but it's ultimately, this is the way a society should be structured. She's come up with these very specific things. Being able to live to the end of human life with normal length. Okay? Being able to avoid unnecessary and non-beneficial pain and to have pleasurable experiences. Well, that's a good thing. We can talk about that all along. Being able to use the senses and imagine and think and reason. being able to live with concern for in relation to animals and the world of nature. All of these things are designed to say what is the well-being, how we can measure well-being in a society is based on whether the society provides these opportunities for the people in that society. A society that does provide these opportunities is a society that we could say has a high level of well-being. A society that doesn't would have a lower level of well-being. That's the idea here. Now there's a really obvious problem here. What if I just don't like any of these things? What if I just want to be someone who is what we'll call a joy guzzler? Someone who just wants to have fun driving around a car, just talking about, which it just has, so it just uses too many gas, super emitted. I love this cartoon. It takes 5 gallons and $127 to get to the end of the driveway. It's awesome, but it's worth it, and I only wish it came in a larger model. Right, so what is, the idea here is that the objective list theory might give you, this is a society in which well-being is highly valued, but I don't care. I'm not getting pleasure in this society. I'm not doing the things that I want to do. And so that leads us to thinking about, okay, well maybe we should go back to the subjective state theory. It doesn't matter what ultimately what theory you want to adopt. I just wanted to give you an indication that the ways of measuring utility that we've been talking about from an economic point of view don't fully capture the range of values that are associated with different notions of well-being. Okay, so does that seem more or less clear that there's these 3 general notions? It's up to you to think about which ones you think are more important or more valuable or more defensible, but they really do raise more ethical questions about how it is that we can ultimately, we can't go around and simply, without question, come up with a metric that's going to measure well-being. Somebody's going to always be able to say, no, you're forgetting about these things, or you're forgetting about these things, or these other things can't be captured in your utility function. So that's the point. I want to turn now in the next half of the class to talking about why we might think it isn't a good idea to be a joy guzzler, and more particularly, whether or not I have responsibilities not to be a joy guzzler. And again, this joy guzzler idea comes from Walter Snow Armstrong. And it's this idea that I want to go out on a Sunday afternoon and ride around in my gas guzzler. Do I have an ethical responsibility, or is there an ethical requirement that I don't do that? So that's, I want to look at some of these questions of responsibility now. Part of the reason we think you shouldn't be able to do that is because, as we've been talking about for the last several weeks, there's a lot of harm that's being produced and will be produced by continued greenhouse gas emissions. The climate is being harmed, there's instrumental harms, there's intrinsic harms, there's harm for humans, there's harms to other species, and there's harms to the biosphere. And you'll remember from the last lecture, we made a distinction between Feinberg harms and Harris harms. In this case, they're both, all of these harms are Feinberg harms, but they're also Harris harms, right? These are harms, and that raises an important question: who's responsible for these harms? Am I the one who's responsible when I drive around in this car that is really inefficient and emits a tremendous amount of greenhouse gases? Well, some people want to say, no, it's not me who's responsible. It's those people. It's the gas companies. They're the ones that are responsible for these harms, right? And we heard last week, if you'll remember, that there's lawsuits that are happening that are trying to say that indeed it is ExxonMobil and Shell that need to be held responsible, legally responsible, financially responsible for the damages that were done from the various hurricanes, and that will continue to be done from these various hurricanes. And there's a new one that is happening in Los Angeles to try to recover some of the costs of damages and harms that have resulted from the extreme weather events that are linked to, as you now know, linked to greenhouse gas emissions. And there, I want to just say a little bit about the standards of legal liability as a way of maybe getting a sense of how we can start to understand what ethical responsibility will look like. So part of what we have in the law is that if you intentionally harm someone, you cause them damages, and you can identify the damages that are caused by your action, and you did it intentionally, you're legally responsible. You might even say you're morally responsible. Those are easy cases, right? Now, what if you do something in which you didn't mean to cause anybody harm, but the harm resulted? Well, part of the tort law in that case says that if you could have foreseen that these harms would have occurred, then you're responsible. You're negligent, and so you're responsible. That's another really interesting kind of responsibility, because what it means is that you need to not just intend a harm to be held liable for that harm, but you also need to think ahead about what it is that you're doing and the harms that could foreseeably emerge. You could be held responsible in that case as well. And then there's this strict liability, and I just wanted to mention strict liability in a legal framework because I think increasingly we're going to see strict liability legal cases in the case of climate impacts. Strict liability is that even if you weren't negligent, that you didn't take the right actions, you actually did foresee, and you did whatever you could to prevent a problem from occurring. And even if you didn't intend it, the kind of practice that you're engaged in is linked to harms. That's what strict liability says. So the first case is a really weird case. It's the case of a mink farmer in Utah who brought a legal case against his neighbor who was having blasting explosives used to open up a particular area of his farm. And as a result of this blasting, all of his minks died. They panicked and died. And so the mink farmer lost a tremendous amount of economic opportunities because his neighbor was using explosives. And the courts found that even though you couldn't foresee minks dying of fear of explosions, or you needn't be that well aware of mink psychology if you're an explosive company. Using explosives is dangerous. It's dangerous. There's all sorts of problems that can occur. So the court found that there's a strict liability in this case because using explosives can always lead to various kinds of harm. So these are interesting, I think, legal frameworks for thinking about whether or not you can hold someone responsible for their actions. Now notice, cause is a central part of this kind of legal responsibility. There are harms that are caused. You can't actually get you can't get damages, you can't get repair if there wasn't some damage caused. But I don't know if that translates clearly into all of the ethical cases. And so I want to just talk a little bit about the ways that causation comes apart from ethical responsibility, even though it's central to legal responsibility. So there's two different concepts that I want to introduce, both based on what gets called moral luck, following Bernard Williams' notion of luck. And here there's an idea that you could have bad moral luck and not be ethically responsible. You could just be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the example, as so many philosophers' examples, is a little bit gruesome, but you're just driving along in your Volt, let's say, so you're not emitting anything terrible, and a skateboarder jumps into the road in front of you and you crash into the skateboarder. Now, the question there is you might be thought to be legally responsible. There's some question of whether you would be. But the idea from an ethical point of view is that actually, this is just a bit of bad moral luck. There was nothing you could do to avoid this, and so maybe you're not responsible for this particular incident. Because you didn't want this to happen. This is something that you could not have done anything to prevent. Let's say you were actually, we can make it even more elaborate, you were driving your Volt so that you could get your friend to the hospital in time for a very important operation, and it was an emergency, or something like that, right? So this happened in the course of doing something otherwise morally praiseworthy. So the idea then is that this is just bad moral luck, and you shouldn't be held responsible. So the notion is that you have caused it. You have caused this, you physically caused this person's injury, the skateboarder's injury. You physically caused it, but you might not be held morally responsible for it. So that takes causation. Causation happened, but moral responsibility didn't. Now here's a case in which there's no actual causation, but you might be held responsible, and this is what we might call a case of good moral luck. So for example, in the Bay Area, in the mid-century, last century, PG&E, an electric company that was quite famous for all sorts of things, including Aaron Brockovich's sort of interesting expose, but they ended up putting a whole bunch of toxics into a particular area in what's called Bayview Hunters Point. Is anybody from the Bay Area? Do you know that area? Anyway, so Bayview Hunters Point now has a bunch of toxics underneath the ground. And some people are getting sick from those toxics. And it's really hard to figure out at this point, because the company is not really the same company anymore. They didn't have any standards for negligence at the time. They didn't know anything. You couldn't say the company could be held responsible for negligence. We haven't gotten to the point yet where we think about electric companies as being strictly liable, although that could happen. We're not there yet. There's no real way of sort of identifying who has caused this problem. But it's true that many, many people in the Bay Area benefited from the cheap electricity that was available, right? So there's some harms that have accrued. It's not clear where the causation lies, but there are some people who we might hold responsible for those damages because they are the beneficiaries of what we might call good moral luck. Okay? So there's two ways in which we could see that causation and responsibility can come apart. I wanted to give you an example from Peter Singer, which is about a child who is in a pond, and talk a little bit about these questions, what they called first called by Derek Parfit, mistakes in moral mathematics. Now, Peter Singer suggests that if you're walking to an important meeting and you come across a child who's drowning in the pond, even though you didn't cause the child to be drowning in the pond, it's your responsibility, because you're there, to pull the child out of the pond. And it's your responsibility to do that from an ethical point of view, even if it will make you late for your class or your important meeting, and even if you might have to ruin your shoes because you might have to wade into the pond a little bit. So it could cause you to cost. You might have some costs associated with it. But even though you haven't caused this child to be in the pond, you're still responsible if you let that child drown. In fact, some people have argued, and I hope you might think this is true as well, that you're kind of a monster if you walk past that child and just let that child drown. So there's a sense in which you're responsible even though you've had no causal relation to that. Now, this is the problem with moral mathematics. I wanted to give you, and I said there wasn't going to be any math. Oh, it's a different kind of math. So would your responsibility change, do you think, if there were two people walking by? You and someone else. What if there were 10 people walking by and you're the farthest one away? Are you still responsible? How responsible are you? take a couple minutes, just 2 minutes, to talk to the person next to you. Think about how you would figure out how responsible you might be. So let's think about the last question in particular. What about 10 people walking by and you're the farthest one away? What's your responsibility to save the child? Is it 100%, 10%, or that's A, B, and C? How do you think that A, B, and C?
Push the A.
Pushing the A.
A again.
A again.
And then
Okay.
B.
Wait, not A.
And then B.
Wait, A again.
Uh-oh.
What happened? Not A again, B.
You push A, and then you push A again, and then you want to push B to bring the graph up.
Okay. We got that, everyone? No? Yeah? B. Now I push B, right? I'm not responsible.
There it goes.
Okay. So, interesting. Let's talk about, I think this is really exciting. So, talk a little, why are you fully responsible if somebody else is walking and you are pretty far away? Yeah.
So what we talked about was more that, like, what would 10% responsibility look like?
Exactly.
Well, how can you be, like, you either save the child or you don't? And so how do you feel 10% responsible for saving the child? Does that mean you do it or not? And so we found, like, if you had any sort of responsibility, then you would be saving them. And so that would end up, in practice, being 100%.
Exactly. Other thoughts about this? I think that's exactly right. But there's something a little bit peculiar about it in our common sense way of thinking about it. For example, if 10 people were sitting around a pool and somebody sort of started struggling in the pool, it does seem a little odd, at least on face value, that we're all equally responsible for saving the person in the middle, that if we all jump in to try to save this person, it could end up being kind of a mess. And Walter Senow Armstrong actually uses this example of minors as another way of thinking about these problems with moral mathematics. He reminds us that, let's say it takes 3 people to save these minors that are trapped. What does the 4th person do when they're added into it? Or a 5th person? You jump in. Those people don't actually contribute to any part of the saving because it only takes 3, right? So there are these really peculiar kinds of features. Now B again. Yes? B?
And then A again.
And then A again. Awesome. So I think that this is it shows that for the most part, you either have a responsibility or you don't, but there are some cases in which this question of responsibility becomes problematic. Now, why is that interesting or important? So let's get back to our joy guzzler. And this is a question, oh yes, go ahead, please.
Just in this case, Are you still responsible if you have to risk your life to save the child? How responsible are you?
So that's a really important point. Often the idea, and comes from Peter Singer's article as well, so this idea of saving the child in the pond who's drowning is an example that's in Famine, Affluence, and Morality, a very important ethics paper that came out, I think it was 1972. The issue there, and he's very explicit about this, and I think it's sensible, is that as long as you're not giving up something that is more valuable than what it is that's at stake. So, for example, in the case of walking past the child in the pond, being late for a meeting or late for class, that's not equivalent to the loss of a life. Ruining your shoes, if you have to wade into the pond, that's not morally equivalent to the loss of a life. Risking your own life to save another's life, that is morally equivalent, and then the responsibility changes once the balance becomes a little bit more equal. Does that help? So if you have to risk your life to save somebody else's life, then you wouldn't be thought to be morally responsible in those kinds of cases. But if it's anything less than something morally equivalent, then you do have responsibility. Does that help? That's the argument that he makes. Okay, and sorry, any other questions about that? So let's go back to the joy guzzler. So one of the things that I think is interesting about these problems in moral mathematics that I want us to be thinking about is whether or not my driving that gas guzzler, or to go back to our beginning example, whether or not my eating those cookies, 1 or 10 of those cookies, actually contributes to the deforestation and extinction of orangutans or the enslavement of children to make chocolate. The idea is that this seem like, on the one hand, imperceptible harms, but it can't be that they're negligible, because if they're negligible, you wouldn't be able to add them all up, right? And so one of the things that we get in Hiller's discussion is that there is a sense in which we can figure out precisely what the responsibility of the guest or the joy guzzler is by taking D, where's my epiphany, right, as a percent of the emissions, and E, which is the contribution to the harm, and we get this. We just take what percent, even if it's really, really tiny, part of the emissions, and we times that by the harm, and that's how we figure out how responsible you might be. Now, Armstrong argues, and if we had more time, and I hope you will do this, you can see that there's a lot of argumentation going on in the papers that I had asked for you to read. But what he basically says is that the causation issue is not at all clear, and there is thus no moral requirement for us to not joy guzzle. No moral requirement for us to not joy guzzle. So what we might think of is that this is, of course, a collective action or a collective responsibility problem, as Professor Fleury said on Monday. But there's two ways of thinking about what that collective responsibility problem sort of leads us to. One is a cumulative model, which is this Hiller model, that says, obviously, there's some accumulation. Maybe we're just a tiny bit responsible. I want to give you an example that makes it seem like that can't really be right. So let's say you don't buy any of those chocolate chip cookies. Your roommate bought the cookies and left them on the counter for days. Like, they're still good because they're cookies. But if you don't eat, if you eat one or don't eat one, somebody's going to eat them. They're already there. They're already there on the counter. He eats one, you eat one. You're not actually adding anything to this cumulative model. Think that there's something forceful about that. Thinking about how really your action doesn't actually contribute to any sort of cumulative process. It might be that there's a threshold process going on. And this is another idea that I think is potentially really quite interesting to think about from an ethical point of view in terms of responsibility. So maybe, let me use a case here that isn't about joy guzzling, but is about meat consumption, animal consumption. We'll be talking about that in a couple weeks. But the idea here is, suppose that you go to the grocery store and you want to buy something, let's say, parts of a lamb. And lamb are sort of cause a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, the production of lamb, high emitting livestock. So you're buying it, it's already in the grocery store. Seems like you're not actually contributing in this cumulative way. But maybe every time someone is, let's say, the 25th purchaser of the product, that causes the store to order more, which causes a demand. So you hit a threshold. If you're number 25, you went into the store, you ordered this lamb parts, and now you have ended up causing the threshold to be met for more demand to be created. So part of the reason I think it's interesting in thinking about cumulative versus threshold models of collective responsibility is that you can still find responsibility in the threshold model that you might not find in the cumulative model. It puts a different kind of perspective on what it is that you're doing, because you probably don't know. In fact, I would suggest you rarely know whether you are that 25th consumer. So the idea is, even if it's not cumulative, you can't really know whether or not your action is the action that brings you over the threshold. So you might as well assume that it is a cumulative model. Take your clickers out again. I want you to just tell me whether or not you think joy riding is okay. Really quickly. Joy guzzling. Joy riding in a gas guzzler. Joy guzzling. Not okay. So is this because you think it's, what is the reason that you think it's not okay? Yeah.
So Senator Armstrong made the point about if a town is getting flooded and you pour a quart of water into the river, then is your quart of water really causing the town to flood? But I thought that was not an accurate example. It's the town is flooding because a bunch of people are pouring quarts of water into the river. So then then you have a moral obligation to not join the crowd of people pouring water into the river.
So that's a really interesting, but I want you to think about why you have that responsibility, particularly if other people are going to continue to pour the water into the river, right? So the idea that Senator Armstrong raises is that other people are doing it. If I stop doing it, other people aren't necessarily going to stop doing it. So my responsibility looks really different in this collective situation.
So if you consider that contributing to pollution is contributing to harm, and you consider that violence is a necessary harm and joy guzzling is theoretically unnecessary because it's just for fun, then you would be contributing to violence. Therefore, that's like...
Right. I agree, but I guess what I'm wanting to push on is, what is the contribution, right? If you're not causing it, what is the contribution? See that I'm running out of time, so let me get rid of that. And I want to try to give you some hints about what it is. We might not be responsible for our individual emissions, but we are maybe collectively responsible for the harms that we will know will accrue if something isn't done to change business as usual, right? And why is that? Well, because we can work together politically. This is what I was hoping you might get to. So if we are joy guzzlers, if we buy products that are the result of child slavery, if we are doing these things, even if we're not causally connected to the harms, there's a political impact of participating in these practices. So there's a political responsibility, which may be different than a causal responsibility or an ethical responsibility for refraining from joy guzzling and refraining from practices. What we could do is, by not doing it, we're sending a message. We're trying to get others to join us politically in this. It's very difficult to get somebody to agree to limit their emissions if you're driving around on Sundays in a gas guzzler. Right? You're not going to be as convincing. So one of the ideas is to look forward to social change, and we'll be much more effective politically if we maybe don't see ourselves as having ethical responsibilities not to joy guzzle, but we recognize that it's really in everybody's best interests, and it will satisfy everybody's well-being, whether it's subjective state well-being, whether it's desire satisfaction well-being, or whether it's objective list well-being, if we all work to stop that kind of practice from happening. Okay, there's some learning objective.